Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one we're going to be checking out the Bandit quest reward changes that were teased just a few days ago for 3.25. And if you didn't catch this one, basically the Bandit quest, that's the deal with the Bandits quest, that's going to be changing in 3.25, and we're going to have different rewards associated with each bandit. So if you help each bandit you get a different buff. And then obviously if you kill all the bandits you usually get 2 passive points. Well, that's now changing. The major change here is that the bandit rewards are now going to be the equivalent of 1 passive point instead of 2, and as a result of this change they'll be adding the missing passive point to another quest in Act 2, that's the quest called Through Sacred Ground, which previously only gave respec points. So what this means is you can choose to receive one of these buffs by sparing the associated bandit, and by doing so you'll now only be losing 1 passive point to gain the respective buff. And of course you can still choose to kill all 3 bandits to receive a passive point, in which case the only change that will be relevant to you is that you now need to do that extra quest Through Sacred Ground to receive the other passive point that you would have previously gotten from killing all 3 bandits. Now this change is an interesting one. Previously the bandit rewards, at least in the case of Alira and Oak, provided some stats which were used in 2 main scenarios. For Alira, the option to forgo receiving 2 passive points to be able to solve mana sustain and help out with resistance capping very early in progression was a great choice for many League start characters, and was particularly useful for newer players too, who are less experienced with gearing and choosing the correct passive points on the skill tree. Later on you would respec out of this choice once you've solved skill costs elsewhere and resistances are no longer an issue. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the old Oak Bandit reward, which provided additional physical damage reduction. And even at just 2% of this stat, it was still used on some builds which were stacking pure physical damage reduction. In those builds, this choice to help Oak and gain this 2% additional PDR would help you reach that 90% cap. And just because of how much value you get out of those final few percentage points provided in terms of actual damage mitigation versus the damage being taken, this was actually quite valuable. Kraityn's buff provided some useful stats, but unless you were in dire need of that final 10% elemental ailment avoidance to cap it out, this one was pretty much never worth it for 2 passive points. So really, the old bandit buffs were mostly just a bit weak in comparison of the 2 passive points, which is why they were barely ever used, especially in late game, and they were just very, very niche. Now, in 3.25, these buffs are being changed in quite a significant way. As mentioned before, all characters will now have access to one of those previous 2 passive points from the Through Sacred Ground quest, and this is completely independent of the bandit choice. Alira's buff will now provide 15% elemental resistances, Oak's buff will provide 40 to maximum life, and Kraityn's buff will provide 8% increased movement speed. Or you can kill all 3 of course for that passive point. So when looking at these buffs now, it's far easier to make a comparison for the value of each of them against a single point. And this is largely because the stats that they now provide are widely available on the tree in many different areas. So let's begin with Alira, as I feel this is the most contentious of the 3. 15% elemental resistance is pretty much bang on the money when it comes to how much of this stat you'd roughly gain from spending 1 point on the tree. Best example being Diamond Skin near the Marauder start location. I think this one, of all the choices, is going to be the one which is respec'd the most come late game, when your resistances are solved through gearing, but I do believe this choice will provide a level of comfort for early progression, especially on some particular builds which don't get any resistances at all from the parting that they go for on the passive skill tree, and are fully reliant on gear for those stats. The Alira Bandit reward option becomes less and less relevant the further from League start you go, as players will start to use twin gear for leveling, and this type of boost is no longer necessary at any point in a character's progression. There will probably be some very rare scenarios where this choice is used in a late game build where gear is starved for suffixes, for example when using many unique items or when attribute stacking, or in a handful of builds using things like Melding of the Flesh, Thread of Hope and Lightning Coil where they need to overcome a very heavy deficit of negative resistances. Next up is Oak's buff, which will now provide plus 40 to maximum life. Once again, this is quite comparable to a passive point spent on the tree, with the closest comparisons being the Life Mastery for plus 50 to maximum life, or Discipline and Training, or the Heart of the Warrior Notables. Unlike the 15% elemental resistance, 40 maximum life is going to be useful no matter which stage of progression a character is at, with the exception of CI builds and most low life builds. Whether this option can compete with 15% elemental resistances or 8% increased movement speed in very early progression in a league start scenario though is a good question to ask. Personally, I'd much rather have 15% elemental resistances if I'm struggling to cap them out, as taking less damage from those incoming elemental hits is far superior to 40 life, especially that early into progression when you barely have any life scaling. Meanwhile, if resistances are not a problem, the 8% increased movement speed is certainly a more appealing option, as once again, early into progression when you likely only have 10% increased movement speed on your boots, or perhaps you even have no increased movement speed on your boots, then that 8% is going to be very impactful. You're going to really feel that boost. However, with that said, I think the value of the 40 maximum life comes into its own later down the line when your build is more fleshed out and you have better life scaling. At that point, the 40 maximum life option has become far superior to the resistance in most setups, and starts to be competitive with the movement speed and the 1 passive point. And of course, I must mention life stacking builds because they're going to love this. I played a life stacking Inquisitor in Necropolis, so I can just showcase this change on the exact build that I played. Here's the passive skill tree for a level 98 character, and there's 1 point missing to be spent, so I'm able to test out and compare these choices. The only really good option left on the tree for me is this 4% life node here on the Juggernaut wheel, and as you can see, allocating this node provides 139 life. Now, if we unallocate that node and instead add plus 40 to maximum life in the custom config, and this would represent taking the Oak power, so losing 1 passive point, this would grant 245 life with all of that life scaling that exists in this build. That's over 100 extra life compared to the next best option, and obviously the mileage is going to vary with this, but I think the plus 40 maximum life option from the Oak choice is going to be very nice on life stacking builds. So lastly, we have Kraityn's 8% increased movement speed. Now I think this is going to be the choice which is used the most of the 3 bandit options for both early progression and in the late game. 8% increased movement speed comparatively with a passive point spent is a very good stat. Most of the movement speed on the passive tree is bundled together with other stats and it's typically around 5%. So 8% on its own is about the right amount to be gained at the expense of a single passive point. And 8% movement speed gained in Act 2 is really, really good. The moment you take this, you will notice a considerable difference, no matter what you're playing or how your gear progression is coming along. Now the interesting thing here is the implications in the late game. I think it's going to be hard for a lot of builds to justify speccing out of this 8% movement speed and finding something worthwhile in its place for that 1 point. Movement speed is just an incredibly powerful stat, and should be seen as both offensive and defensive, and also just a general multiplier to how fast you're able to execute gameplay, including things like picking up loot. I expect we're going to see a lot more players interacting with these bandit buffs on a lot of characters going forward, especially compared to the incredibly low amount before. I think the balance of these buffs is a lot better now, where dropping a passive point should feel like a worthy trade-off in most scenarios. But one thing I would like to say, there was no mention of this in the teaser, but I feel that the recipe for respecking the bandit choice should be modified as a result of it now only being equivalent to a single passive point instead of 2. The current recipe requires 20 Orbs of Regret, and I think this should be halved down to 10, but this may already be a change that exists and they just didn't want to bloat the teaser out too much, so they held back their information. We'll have to wait and see in the patch notes. Regardless, I think this change is a positive one and one that will genuinely provide a more compelling choice to the player, but what do you think about this Bandit Quest reward change? Perhaps you prefer the older, more niche options that were there? Let me know by commenting below. Thank you for watching this video and thank you for your ongoing support. As always, stay tuned and stay safe.